I didn't inapos say a single word during her 20-minute power trip. I just sat there in the back of the community center, feeling the weight of the property survey in my lap, and watching 47 of my neighbors slowly realize they'd been driving on my private land for free for the last 30 years. Picture this. You've got the HOA president, a woman named Beverly Vance, standing at the podium in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my first truck, waving around a legal demand for $70,000 because I had the audacity to fix the potholes in front of my own house. She had the whole 9 yards, the PowerPoint slides with red arrows, the fake engineering reports from her brother-in-law, and even brought 2 suit-and-tie lawyers just to make sure I felt small. But what Beverly didn't know was that every single luxury SUV in that parking lot had to cross a 50-foot stretch of asphalt that belonged to me and me alone. The road she was so worried about protecting from my unauthorized repairs was actually an inheritance from my late Uncle Henry, the man who'd literally carved this neighborhood out of the woods in the 80s. And let me tell you, there's no feeling in the world quite like watching a bully realize they just walked into a trap they spent 6 months digging for you. My name's Mark Sterling, I'm 54, and I spent 30 years as a structural engineer building bridges that were meant to last a century. So I'm not exactly the kind of guy who gets intimidated by a woman with a clipboard and a vendetta. I moved into Silver Creek Estates back in 2019 after a divorce that pretty much stripped my gears, looking for a place where I could just fix up an old ranch house, grow some tomatoes, and have a quiet spot for my daughter, Chloe, to visit on the weekends. At first, Silver Creek was exactly what I needed, a little slice of the American dream with mature oaks and neighbors who'd give you a nod while they mowed their lawns. But then the world changed, and the neighborhood started changing with it. We got a wave of new money coming in, people who saw a neighborhood not as a place to live, but as an investment to be policed, and leading that charge was Beverly Vance. She moved in 3 years ago, driving a white Porsche and carrying herself like she'd been appointed the queen of suburbia, and within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency and turned our quiet streets into a low-grade surveillance state. Beverly was the kind of person who didn't just follow the rules. She lived to catch you breaking them. And I'm talking about a woman who would literally get out of her car to measure your grass with a wooden ruler if she thought it looked a quarter inch too high. She lived in this massive, overly manicured house with her husband, Gerald, who was a high-priced corporate tax attorney and always looked like he was one step away from an ulcer, probably from spent all his time apologizing for Beverly's behavior. They didn't have kids, they didn't have hobbies, they just had the HOA. And for Beverly, that meant making sure everyone's life was as sterile and controlled as a hospital hallway. The real trouble started in the spring of 2024 after a winter that had been absolutely brutal on our infrastructure, leaving the main entrance road, Ridgeview Drive, looking like it had been hit by a mortar strike. There were potholes so deep you could see the original rebar, and every morning I'd hear the sickening thud scrape of my neighbors' cars bottoming out as they tried to leave for work. Being an engineer, it killed me to watch a perfectly good road fall apart. So I did what any rational person would do. I sent a polite email to the board offering my professional services to coordinate a repair crew. I told them I had the contacts, I could get the materials at cost, and we could have the whole thing patched and sealed in 48 hours. But Beverly's response came back in less than 10 minutes, and it was basically a digital slap in the face. She told me that all infrastructure modifications required a formal bidding process through HOA-approved vendors and that any unauthorized tampering with common areas would result in immediate legal action. 6 weeks went by. The potholes turned into craters, and the HOA did absolutely nothing except hold meetings about what color of beige we should be allowed to paint our mailboxes. That was the breaking point for me, especially after I saw Mrs. Gable, this sweet 80-year-old widow who's lived here since the beginning, nearly blow out a tire and veer into a ditch, try to avoid a particularly nasty hole near the entrance. I call my old buddy Silas, a guy who owns a paving company and smells like diesel and honest work, and we spent a Saturday morning doing it right, filling the holes with high-grade hot mix, tamping it down, and sealing it so it would actually hold. I paid Silas $4,000 out of my own pocket just to get it done because I was tired of seeing my neighbors' cars get trashed, and honestly, I thought people would be happy. For about 2 days, I was the neighborhood hero, with people stopping their cars to give me a thumbs up or leaving bags of homegrown lemons on my porch. But then the certified letter arrived. Beverly didn't end oppose. T just sent a fine. She sent a declaration of war, accusing me of, in quote, willful destruction of community property, in quote, and, in quote, unlicensed engineering, in quote, demanding that I pay for the, in quote, remediation, in quote, of the road to bring it back to HOA standards. Her version of remediation was and oppose. T just fixing it. She wanted the entire section of road ripped up and repaved by her, in quote, approved, in quote, contractor, who just happened to be a guy Gerald played golf with every Sunday, at a cost that was 10 times the market rate. The fine started at $500, but Beverly added a, in quote, daily non-compliance fee, in quote, of $300, and within a month, the bill was already over $10,000 and climbing. She started a smear campaign on the neighborhood app, telling everyone I was a, in quote, rogue element, in quote, who was trying to tank our property values with, in quote, substandard DIY work, in quote, and the crazy part was that some of the newer residents actually believed her. I'd walk down the street and see people who used to wave suddenly find something very interesting to look at on their phones, and it felt like the whole atmosphere of the place had curdled into something bitter. But while Beverly was busy taking photos of my trash cans and measuring the distance my truck was parked from the curb, I was doing some deep dive research into the history of Silver Creek estates that I've been putting off for years. My Uncle Henry was a bit of an eccentric, a developer who hated bureaucrats and loved loopholes. And when he passed away in 2018, he left me a mountain of yellowing folders and maps that I just shoved into the attic of the ranch house. One night, fueled by a lot of black coffee and a healthy dose of spite, I started digging through those boxes and found a map that made my heart stop. Back in 1985, when Henry was selling off the lots, he'd run into a dispute with the county about who was going to maintain the main access road. So in a classic move of defiance, he just decided to keep the title to a 50-foot strip of land that encompassed the entire entrance of the subdivision. He never dedicated it to the public, and he never transferred it to the HOA when it was formed a few years later. He kept it in a private holding company called Sterling Development, LLC, which was now sitting in my name. I was sitting there at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, holding a deed that proved I didn't end oppose. T just live in the neighborhood. I effectively owned the gate to it. I didn't end oppose. T say anything to anyone. Not even Chloe. I just hired a top-tier real estate attorney named Elias Thorne, a guy who looks like a friendly grandfather but has the killer instinct of a shark. Elias spent a week verifying the chain of title, and when he called me back, his voice was hovering somewhere between a chuckle and a growl. He told me, in quote, Mark, not only do you own that road, but the HOA has been technically trespassing every time they've sent a maintenance crew or a security patrol through that entrance for the last 3 decades, end quote. He explained that while the residents had end quote, prescriptive easement, end quote, to get to their homes, that easement didn't end oppose. T give the HOA the right to regulate what I did on my own property, and it certainly didn't end oppose. T give them the right to fine me for maintaining it. But Beverly was still in the dark, and she was getting more aggressive by the day, eventually scheduling this, in quote, emergency enforcement hearing, in quote, where she planned to vote on a lien against my house to collect the now $70,000 in fines and legal fees. That brings us back to that meeting in the community center with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the smell of stale coffee in the air. Beverly was at the height of her power, standing there with her PowerPoint showing a, in quote, safety analysis, in quote, that claimed my road repairs were a liability, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern that bullies use when they think they've already won. She looked at me and said, end quote, Mr. Sterling, we've tried to be reasonable, but your blatant disregard for the standards of Silver Creek is something we simply cannot overlook. So unless you're prepared to pay the $70,000 tonight, the board will be moving forward with the foreclosure process on your property. End quote. The room was dead silent. You could hear the air conditioner kicking on, and I just stood up, smoothed out my shirt, and walked to the front with my folder. I didn't oppose. To raise my voice, I just asked for a microphone and said, and quote, Beverly, before we get into the fines, I think we need to talk about the fact that this HOA doesn't end oppose. T actually have jurisdiction over Ridgeview Drive. End quote. She gave this little condescending laugh and told me I was being, end quote, delusional, end quote. But then I turned on the projector I brought and put the 1985 deed up on the screen. I walked the room through the property lines, showing them exactly where the HOA land ended and my private property began, and I watched the color slowly drain out of Beverly's face until she looked like she'd seen a ghost. I told the room, and quote, "I've been paying the property taxes on this road since 2018, and I've been letting everyone use it for free out of the goodness of my heart. But since the HOA seems to think I'm such a liability, I've decided to take your advice and treat this as a strictly professional matter." End quote. I handed a stack of papers to the board members, which were formal, end quote. Notice of revocation of implied license, end quote. Letters effectively telling the HOA that they were no longer allowed to perform any activities on my land, including their, end quote, approved, end quote, paving projects or their security patrols. I then announced that starting the following Monday, I would be installing a private toll and maintenance gate at the entrance, and while residents would still have access, any commercial vehicle, delivery truck, or HOA contractor would be charged a, end quote, heavy usage fee, end quote, of $200 per entry to cover the wear and tear on my private asphalt. The room erupted. People were shouting. Beverly was screaming about, end quote, blackmail, end quote. But Elias stood up next to me and calmly informed her that everything we were doing was strictly by the book. The best part was watching her lawyers, the guys she'd brought to intimidate me, suddenly start whispering frantically to each other and tucking their files into their briefcases, because they knew the moment that deed hit the screen that their case had just evaporated into thin air. The fallout was like a slow-motion explosion that leveled the entire HOA hierarchy over the next few weeks. Once the neighbors realized that Beverly had nearly cost the community hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential litigation and, end quote, toll fees, end quote, just because she had a personal grudge against me, the tide turned overnight. It turns out, when you tell a bunch of wealthy people that their Amazon packages might be delayed or their landscaping crews might be blocked because of the HOA president's ego, they find their backbone real quick. We had an emergency election where Beverly was ousted by a landslide, and when the new board took a look at the books, they found exactly what I suspected. Gerald's law firm had been taking massive retainers from the HOA for years, and that, end quote. Approved contractor, end quote. Friend of his had been overcharging the community by 40% and kicking back, end quote. Consulting fees, end quote, to a shell company Beverly owned. I didn't end oppose. He ended up putting in the toll gate because, like I said, I end oppose. Am not a jerk, I just wanted to be left alone to grow my tomatoes. I worked out a deal with the new board where I leased the road to the community for $1 a year in exchange for a permanent seat on the infrastructure committee and a total dismissal of all my fines, plus a formal written apology from the association. Beverly and Gerald ended up selling their house at a loss about 6 months later because nobody in the neighborhood would even look at them anymore. And I heard they moved to some gated community in Florida where hopefully the HOA president is even meaner than she was. Now, when I walk down the street, people actually stop and talk to me, not because they're afraid of me owning the road, but because we finally got a community that feels like a neighborhood again, where we worry more about the people living next door than the height of their grass. But here's the thing that still keeps me thinking. How many other people out there are living under the thumb of some petty tyrant who doesn't end oppose? To even have the legal ground they're standing on? I got lucky because of my Uncle Henry's spite, but it makes you wonder about the balance of power in these little suburban kingdoms and why we let people like Beverly run our lives in the first place. I've had a few folks from the next town over reach out to me asking for advice on their own HOA battles, and I always tell them the same thing. Don't just read the bylaws, read the dirt, because you never know what's buried under the pavement. So, I want to hear from you guys. Have you ever dealt with a neighborhood, end quote, standards coordinator, end quote, who went too far? Or maybe you found a loophole that saved your sanity. Do you think I was right to play the, end quote, private road, end quote, card? Or was I being just as petty as she was? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Because honestly, I think we've all got at least one story about a neighbor who thought they were the king of the cul-de-sac. Don and Oppos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories about ordinary people taking back their power, and I and Oppos. LL catch you in the next one.